Picture this. The year is 1347, and a shadow creeps across Europe. Entire cities fall silent, streets littered with bodies, the air thick with the stench of death. The Black Death wasn't just a plague, it was a nightmare made real, wiping out nearly half of Europe's population in just a few horrifying years. But what if history's deadliest pandemic wasn't what it seemed? What if the Black Death was more than a natural disaster? What if it was a carefully crafted cover-up, hiding something far darker? Strange details linger in the historical record. Reports of sudden, unexplained deaths that didn't match typical plague symptoms. Towns wiped out overnight with no trace of rats or fleas, the usual suspects blamed for spreading the disease. Even stranger, some accounts describe bizarre, almost ritualistic behavior among the dying, whispers of secret societies operating in the shadows. Could the devastation have been a smokescreen for something more sinister? A power grab, a purge, or even a weapon unleashed by an unknown hand? This isn't just a question about the past, it's a puzzle that challenges everything we think we know. Because if the Black Death wasn't just a tragedy of nature, but a deliberate act, then history's darkest chapter might be hiding an even darker truth. And that's exactly what we're about to explore. From cryptic medieval texts to eerily precise patterns of death, we'll piece together the evidence, follow the breadcrumbs, and ask, was the Black Death a cover-up for something else? The answers might just rewrite history, so settle in because what you're about to hear will make you question everything. To understand why the Black Death sparks such chilling conspiracy theories, we first need to grasp the sheer scale of its horror. The plague exploded across Europe between 1347 and 1351, a wildfire of death that moved faster than anyone could comprehend. It slithered along trade routes, hitched rides on merchant ships, and seeped into cities through crowded ports. Within months, bustling centers like Florence and Paris became graveyards. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate between 25 and 50 million lives were lost, wiping out 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Whole villages vanished, families erased overnight, leaving empty homes and untended fields to rot. But here's where things get eerie. The plague didn't strike evenly. Some towns were decimated while neighboring ones remained untouched, as if death itself was picking its targets. The symptoms defied logic. Victims coughed blood, their skin blackened with grotesque swellings, and many died within days. Yet some accounts describe stranger afflictions, paralysis, madness, even people dropping dead mid-conversation with no visible marks. The usual explanation points to rats and fleas, but why did some regions with rampant rodents escape unscathed? And why did the plague sometimes spread faster than any animal could travel? The societal collapse was just as bizarre. Panic turned neighbors against each other. Some abandoned the sick, others plunged into wild hysteria, convinced the end had come. Governments crumbled, economies collapsed, and the church, usually a pillar of stability, stood powerless. In the chaos, fringe groups gained alarming influence. Shadowy figures moved through the wreckage, some preaching doom, others offering dubious cures. Rumors swirled of deliberate poisonings, of secret groups exploiting the chaos. This wasn't just a disease, it was a breakdown of reality itself. And that breakdown left cracks in history, cracks where darker theories take root. Because when death moves in patterns that defy nature, when power shifts too conveniently in the aftermath, you have to ask, was the Black Death merely a tragedy or something far more deliberate? The deeper we dig, the stranger the clues become. The Black Death didn't spread like an ordinary disease, it moved with a precision that defies natural explanation. Historians often point to medieval trade routes as the primary highways for the plague, carried by rats and fleas on merchant ships and wagons. But when you map the outbreaks, something doesn't add up. Take the case of Milan, a bustling trade hub surrounded by infected cities. While places like Venice and Genoa were ravaged, Milan remained eerily untouched for years, as if shielded by an invisible hand. Meanwhile, remote villages far from major roads were suddenly wiped out overnight, their isolation offering no protection. Even stranger were the accounts of sudden, explosive outbreaks in tightly controlled spaces. Monasteries, usually secluded and clean, were sometimes hit harder than crowded slums. In one chilling report from England, an entire convent fell ill within hours of a mysterious visitor's arrival, long before any rats could have infiltrated the grounds. Then there's the speed. The plague advanced faster than any medieval traveler could ride, sometimes leaping hundreds of miles in days. Some researchers point to the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, where chroniclers claimed invaders catapulted diseased corpses over city walls. If true, this would mark one of history's earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. But the plague spread after Kaffa doesn't follow a neat trail of contagion. It erupts in scattered pockets, bypassing some regions entirely. Could someone have been steering it? The timing raises more questions. The Black Death arrived just as Europe's power structures were fracturing, kingdoms weak, the church divided. In the chaos, certain groups gained unprecedented influence. The sudden disappearance of entire villages conveniently cleared land for powerful lords. Jewish communities, scapegoated as poisoners, were massacred, their wealth confiscated. Coincidence or calculated opportunism? The patterns suggest something beyond blind nature. Whether by weaponized disease, deliberate sabotage, or something even darker, the Black Death spread feels less like an accident of biology and more like a shadow moving with purpose. And if that's true, then what or who was really pulling the strings? For over a century, we've been told a simple story about the Black Death. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried the plague, and that's how Europe died. But modern research is tearing that narrative apart. Take Norway, frigid, rat-free, and yet decimated by the plague, or Iceland, where historical records show no mention of rats at all, but where the death toll was catastrophic. If rats were the key players, why did the plague ravage regions where they couldn't possibly survive? The timing doesn't line up either. In London, outbreaks erupted during winter months when fleas, cold-blooded creatures, would have been dormant. And while flea bites leave distinct marks, many plague victims showed no signs of them at all. Some contemporary accounts describe people falling ill after simply being near the sick, with no rodent or flea in sight. Even the speed of infection defies logic. Fleas can't hitchhike faster than a horse can gallop, yet the plague outpaced medieval travel networks by weeks. Then there's the bizarre case of Iam, an English village that quarantined itself during an outbreak. Rats, being rats, don't respect human boundaries, yet the plague mysteriously stopped at Iam's borders, sparing nearby towns. If fleas were the culprits, how did they obey the quarantine? Modern DNA analysis adds another wrinkle. While traces of the plague bacterium have been found in some medieval remains, they're absent in others, even among victims buried in mass graves. Could some plague deaths have been caused by something else entirely? A weapon, a poison, or even a different disease unleashed under cover of the panic? The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. The rat-and-flea story is full of holes, and when the official explanation crumbles, that's when the real mysteries begin. Because if nature wasn't the killer, then what was? The siege of Kaffa in 1347 reads like something out of a nightmare, but it might also be one of history's first recorded acts of biological warfare. According to medieval chronicler Gabriel de Mussy, the Mongol army, frustrated by their stalled siege of this Crimean port city, resorted to a horrifying tactic. They catapulted the corpses of their own dead men, rotting from a mysterious illness, over the walls and into the city. Within days, the streets of Kaffa reeked of death, and soon its people began falling ill with the same gruesome symptoms. This account has long been cited as ground zero for Europe's Black Death, the moment the plague leaped from east to west, but the more you examine the details, the stranger the story becomes. For one, de Mussi wasn't actually in Kaffa. He was hundreds of miles away in Italy, piecing together events from second-hand reports. His description of diseased corpses flying through the air feels almost cinematic, raising questions about how much is fact and how much is medieval spin. Even if the Mongols did hurl dead bodies, would that have been enough to spark a continent-wide pandemic? Plague bacteria typically die quickly in corpses exposed to open air, making transmission unlikely. Then there's the timeline problem. The siege ended in February 1347, but the plague didn't explode in Europe until months later. If the disease truly escaped Kaffa via fleeing Italian merchants, why the delay? And why did outbreaks erupt simultaneously in places like Sicily and Marseille, ports far from Kaffa's trade routes? This discrepancy has led some historians to suggest the Mongols weren't the only ones playing with fire. Venetian and Genoese traders, locked in a bitter rivalry for control of Black Sea commerce, had both motive and opportunity to weaponize the chaos. Could one side have deliberately spread the plague to cripple the other? The deeper you dig, the more Kaffa looks less like an isolated atrocity and more like a single move in a much deadlier game. Because if the Mongols really did unleash the plague as a weapon, they wouldn't have been the last. Across Europe, whispers persist of other outbreaks with suspicious timing, towns that burned just as political enemies gained the upper hand, regions that mysteriously collapsed when rebellions grew too strong. Whether by accident or design, the Black Death became the perfect smokescreen for power grabs, vendettas, and unchecked ambition. And that raises a chilling question. If the plague was wielded as a weapon even once, how many other times did history simply look away? Medieval doctors faced the Black Death armed with little more than guesswork and superstition, and their confusion became fertile ground for paranoia to take root. These physicians, trained in ancient theories of humors and miasmas, had no concept of germs or contagion. When patients dropped dead with blackened skin and swollen lymph nodes, the best explanation they could muster was that poisonous air or perhaps an angry god was to blame. But in the absence of real answers, fear filled the void, and fear, as history shows, loves a scapegoat. By 1348, a sinister rumor was spreading faster than the plague itself, that someone was deliberately poisoning wells to spread the disease. In cities like Strasbourg and Basel, panicked mobs turned on Jewish communities, accusing them of concocting deadly potions from toads, spiders, and human blood. Never mind that Jewish neighborhoods were being decimated by the plague, too. Logic crumbled under the weight of terror. What's chilling is how these accusations followed an almost identical script across Europe, as if someone had orchestrated the hysteria. Some historians point to an infamous confession extracted under torture in Savoy, where a Jewish man admitted to poisoning wells with a mysterious black powder. That forced confession was copied and circulated like wildfire, giving violent mobs the excuse they needed. But here's the twist: many of the accused were wealthy moneylenders, their assets conveniently seized after their executions. Coincidence or a calculated purge? The church's role in this frenzy was murky. While some clergy condemned the violence, others fanned the flames. In Mainz, a local bishop tried to protect the Jewish population, only to be overruled by a mob that burned 600 people alive. Meanwhile, opportunistic rulers used the chaos to cancel debts owed to Jewish lenders, wiping their ledgers clean with blood. This wasn't just ignorance run amok, it was a weaponization of fear. Because when people can't explain a disaster, they'll invent a villain. And in the shadow of the Black Death, those villains were chosen not by evidence but by convenience. The real poison wasn't in the wells, it was in the whispers that turned neighbors into targets and desperation into a license to kill. When the Black Death arrived, the Catholic Church stood at the heart of medieval life, the ultimate authority on truth, morality, and even medicine. But faced with a catastrophe that defied prayer and penance, the institution's response revealed cracks in its divine armor. At first, clergy preached that the plague was God's wrath upon a sinful world, urging frantic crowds to repent through self-flagellation and pilgrimages. Some priests even led processions of wailing penitents through streets littered with corpses, their ritual scourging meant to atone for humanity's collective guilt. Yet when those same priests began dying alongside their flocks, faith alone proved a feeble shield. The Church's inability to halt the devastation sparked quiet desperation and quiet opportunism. As graveyards overflowed, the sale of indulgences skyrocketed. These slips of paper promising reduced time in purgatory for the dead became a booming trade. Fear-stricken families paid exorbitant sums, hoping to buy their loved ones passage to heaven. Meanwhile, donations to monasteries surged as the wealthy sought divine favor, filling church coffers even as Europe's economy collapsed. But beneath this veneer of piety simmered something darker, a systematic silencing of dissent. Medical texts suggesting natural causes for the plague were dismissed as heresy, while healers offering alternative remedies risked accusations of witchcraft. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI's personal physician openly questioned miasma theory, noting that the disease seemed to spread person to person, an observation that aligned eerily with modern germ theory. His writings were quietly buried, deemed too dangerous for public discourse. The Church's tight control over information raises unsettling questions. Were they merely preserving order in a collapsing world, or actively suppressing truths that might undermine their authority? Consider the sudden disappearance of certain manuscripts from monastic libraries during the plague years, including Arab medical texts that described contagious diseases in detail. Even more telling is how quickly the Church later canonized saints associated with plague protection like Saint Roch, turning terror into a tool for reinforcing devotion. By the time the worst of the plague passed, the Church emerged paradoxically weakened in spiritual authority but richer in land and wealth. Entire villages left without heirs defaulted to ecclesiastical ownership, while the pious donations of the desperate built grand new cathedrals. Whether by design or disaster, the Black Death didn't just test the Church, it reshaped it, leaving behind a trail of burned books, emptied coffers, and whispers of truths too dangerous to survive. One of the most unsettling gaps in the Black Death narrative isn't just what history tells us, it's what's conspicuously missing. Entire archives from the 14th century vanish at the very moment they should be overflowing with first-hand accounts. Town records, medical treatises, even personal diaries, documents that could have shed light on the plague's true nature were either lost, burned, or deliberately erased. Take the case of the Sorbonne Medical Faculty in Paris, which produced detailed reports on the plague's progression. Only a handful of those pages survive today, and curiously, the ones that remain skip over descriptions of symptoms that didn't fit the official narrative. Then there's the mysterious disappearance of the Avignon papal registers. These meticulous records kept by the Catholic Church documented everything from judicial rulings to correspondence with kings. But the volumes covering 1348 to 1350, the peak of the plague, are gone. Historians once chalked this up to poor preservation until a 17th century scholar's private letters surfaced, mentioning a secret order to destroy certain sensitive folios related to the Great Mortality. What was so dangerous it needed to be scrubbed from history? Equally telling are the gaps in merchant logs from Venice and Genoa. These trading powerhouses kept obsessive records of cargo, travel routes, and outbreaks, yet key entries from plague years show signs of tampering. Some pages are torn, others overwritten with vague, almost coded language. In one instance, a ship's manifest lists a shipment of black salt arriving from Crimea just before an outbreak, a term never used before or after in Venetian trade documents. Was this a euphemism for something far deadlier? Even personal accounts raise red flags. The famous Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani wrote extensively about the plague until his own sudden death in 1348. His brother Matteo took over the chronicle, but entire passages about the plague's origins are oddly sanitized, as if someone had a hand in editing the story. And in England, the Rolls of Parliament from 1349 mention a great silence enforced on discussions of the plague's cause, with penalties for those who spread false tales. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. Across Europe, the paper trail goes cold exactly where answers should be. Whether burned by panicked officials, censored by the church, or hidden by those with something to gain, these missing records don't just hide history, they rewrite it. Because when the documents vanish, so does the truth, and in that silence, the real story of the Black Death may still be waiting to be found. The Black Death has long been pinned on a single culprit, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind bubonic plague. But cracks in that theory keep widening, revealing a far messier truth. Modern DNA analysis has detected traces of Yersinia in some mass graves, yet in others, the genetic signature is conspicuously absent. Even stranger, many skeletons show none of the telltale bone lesions typically left by bubonic infections. If Yersinia wasn't the sole killer, what else was lurking in the shadows? Recent studies point to a grim possibility. The Black Death may have been a perfect storm of multiple diseases. Anthrax, for instance, a pathogen that causes rapid, gruesome deaths, flourishes in soil where livestock are buried. When famine forced desperate peasants to dig up rotting carcasses for food, they could have unleashed a second invisible wave of death. Then there's typhus, spread by lice, whose symptoms, high fever, delirium, and dark skin rashes, mirror many medieval accounts. Unlike fleas, lice thrive in cold weather, explaining outbreaks that erupted during winters when rodents should have been dormant. But the most chilling theory involves something far more deliberate. Medieval texts describe symptoms that don't fit any known natural disease. Victims bleeding from pores like sweating blood or collapsing mid-step without visible swelling. These accounts eerily resemble hemorrhagic fevers, viruses like Ebola, which were unknown in 14th century Europe. Could someone have weaponized a strain centuries before modern germ theory? The timing is suspicious. Just decades before the plague, Arabic medical texts detailing advanced virology were translated in Moorish Spain, texts that later vanished from European libraries. The strangest clue comes from Venetian quarantine records. Ships arriving from the east were sometimes flagged for carrying malignant air in sealed jars, a practice with no medical basis unless those jars held something else entirely. Whether by accident or design, the Black Death's mosaic of horrors suggests nature wasn't working alone. And if other pathogens were in play, the real story of the plague isn't just about rats, it's about secrets buried in bone and blood. Genetic research has peeled back layers of the Black Death's mystery, only to reveal something even more puzzling. When scientists extracted DNA from 14th century mass graves, they expected to find a single, uniform strain of Yersinia pestis. Instead, they uncovered a genetic patchwork. Some samples showed mutations so rare they'd only appear once in millennia under natural conditions. Others contained gene sequences eerily similar to modern lab-engineered pathogens. These anomalies don't just challenge our understanding of the plague, they whisper of something far stranger at work. Take the case of the LONDO2C7N strain, reconstructed from skeletons buried in East Smithfield. Its genome carries a unique mutation in the PLA gene, a switch that supercharges the bacteria's ability to invade human lungs. This variant didn't exist in earlier plague outbreaks, nor does it appear in nature today. Yet it emerged suddenly in the Black Death's peak, vanishing just as quickly when the pandemic ended. The odds of this mutation arising spontaneously are astronomically low, like rolling the same impossible number on a dice 100 times in a row. Some researchers speculate it was artificially selected, perhaps unknowingly, through medieval attempts to weaponize the disease. Even more unsettling are the traces of horizontal gene transfer, scrambled DNA segments that suggest the bacteria swapped genetic material with other microbes. One strain found in Barcelona's archives contains a plasmid, a tiny ring of DNA that matches no known natural source. Modern science can engineer similar plasmids to enhance virulence, but in the 14th century, the only laboratories capable of such precision belonged to alchemists, whose secretive workshops dabbled in everything from poisons to primitive germ theory. The timing of these mutations defies coincidence. Genetic dating pins the most radical changes to the years immediately following the siege of Kaffa, precisely when rumors swirled of captured physicians forced to refine biological weapons for Mongol warlords. And in the plague's aftermath, certain monasteries began stockpiling medical texts that referenced culturing diseases, their pages later scorched by church purges. Whether by nature's caprice or human hands, the Black Death's genetic fingerprints don't match any textbook model of evolution. They suggest a pathogen shaped by forces beyond mere chance, a shadow still lingering in our DNA, waiting to confess its true origins. Amidst the devastation of the Black Death, a peculiar pattern emerged. Some communities walked through the carnage untouched, as if shielded by an invisible barrier. Take the village of Iam in England, where residents sealed themselves off during an outbreak, expecting certain doom. Yet while half perished, the other half survived without a single symptom. Then there were the Roma populations across Europe, frequently exposed to plague-ridden cities yet mysteriously resistant. Even stranger, certain monastic orders reported near-zero deaths despite tending to the sick daily. These weren't just flukes, they were clues pointing to a hidden layer in the plague story. One theory hinges on genetics. Modern research reveals that descendants of Black Death survivors often carry a mutation in the ARAP2 gene, a quirk that turbocharges the immune system's ability to recognize and destroy plague bacteria. This mutation is startlingly common in regions that weathered the pandemic best, like parts of Italy and Scandinavia. But here's the catch: the mutation wouldn't have spread so widely in just a few generations unless the survivors had another advantage. Some historians suggest secretive medieval healers, often women or Jewish physicians persecuted as witches, may have pioneered crude immunity treatments using herbs like yarrow or elderberry, which we now know contain compounds that mimic modern antibiotics. Then there's the chilling possibility of selective exposure. Records from Marseille describe wealthy families who retreated to isolated estates, burning all incoming mail and requiring visitors to quarantine for 40 days, a practice that gave us the word quarantine. But in some cases, their survival seemed too precise. The aristocratic Visconti family in Milan not only avoided infection but emerged from the plague years with doubled landholdings, leading to whispers that they discovered how to target the disease. A single page from a confiscated alchemist's journal hints at this, a recipe for a black mist that sickened only those who hadn't consumed a daily tonic of vinegar and crushed emerald. Was this folklore or a coded blueprint for biological warfare? The most haunting survivors, though, were the so-called plague dancers. In German towns where death rates topped 90%, these wandering performers would enter infected homes, breathing the same air as the dying yet never fell ill. Contemporary accounts describe them drinking a murky liquid from vials before each performance, sometimes even rubbing it on their skin. No recipe survives, but chemical analysis of stains on one performer's excavated mask revealed traces of mercury and sulfur, ingredients used centuries later in the first vaccines. Whether through genetic luck, stolen knowledge, or something more sinister, these pockets of immunity defy simple explanation. Because if survival wasn't random, then the Black Death's deadliest secret might not be how it killed, but how some were chosen to live. When the Black Death swept through Europe, the streets ran with blood, but not all of it was spilled by disease. behind the scenes, a quieter, more calculated kind of violence unfolded. While peasants and artisans dropped dead by the millions, Europe's elite were playing a very different game, one where the plague wasn't just a tragedy, it was an opportunity. Land, power, and wealth changed hands at an unprecedented rate, often in ways that defied mere coincidence. Take the case of England's Statute of Labourers in 1351. With workers now scarce, wages should have skyrocketed, but instead, King Edward III froze them at pre-plague levels, effectively turning survivors into indentured servants. Who stood to gain? The landed gentry, who suddenly found their fields untended and their profits vanishing. The debt erasures were even more brazen. Jewish moneylenders had long been the backbone of medieval finance, holding the promissory notes of kings and merchants alike. But when pogroms swept through cities like Strasbourg and Frankfurt, entire ledgers burned along with their keepers. In Mainz alone, over 6,000 Jewish residents were massacred in a single day, conveniently wiping out nearly 200,000 florins in outstanding debts. The timing was suspiciously precise. Many of these riots erupted not at the plague's peak, but as creditors began demanding repayment from nobles who'd squandered fortunes on extravagant tournaments and wars. Then there were the land grabs. With entire families wiped out, properties fell into legal limbo. Normally, these would pass to distant relatives or the church, but not during the plague. Court records from Burgundy show aristocratic families like the Valois exploiting loopholes to seize vacant farms, sometimes by producing forged wills. In Florence, the powerful Albizzi family annexed whole neighborhoods by claiming they'd been abandoned, despite evidence of surviving heirs. The legal chaos was so extreme that Pope Clement VI had to issue a special decree against those who would feast upon the bones of the dead. Perhaps the most damning evidence lies in trade. Venetian merchant Filippo Argenti left behind ledgers showing how his partners stockpiled grain during outbreaks, then sold it at 60 times the usual price. Meanwhile, the Datini archives reveal secret pacts between wool merchants to suppress production, artificially inflating prices as demand for burial shrouds soared. This wasn't just profiteering, it was economic engineering on a scale only possible because the plague had erased all oversight. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. From London to Constantinople, the same players emerged richer: landlords who consolidated fields, bankers who erased debts, and merchants who manipulated markets. Nature may have sparked the fire, but human hands fanned the flames, and in the ashes of the Black Death, a new world order rose, one where power was no longer inherited, but seized in the chaos of a crisis that someone, somewhere might have seen coming. Beneath the terror of the Black Death, an even darker whisper slithered through medieval Europe that the plague wasn't an accident of nature, but the work of alchemists and secret societies wielding poison as a weapon. In an age where science blurred with magic, these shadowy figures operated in candlelit workshops, their experiments veiled in symbols and secrecy. Some claimed they'd unlocked the power to summon disease itself, bottling Chinese letter in glass vials, or weaving it into the very air. The rumors weren't entirely baseless. Alchemical texts from the period describe eerie recipes for universal solvents, capable of dissolving life as easily as gold. One surviving manuscript, the Liber Igneum or Book of Fires, details a concoction of powdered toad, arsenic, and black salt, a term also found in Venetian shipping logs during outbreaks. When sprinkled on door handles or mixed into wine, the text promises it could induce a sickness of the lungs and blackening of the blood. Was this poetic metaphor or a coded instruction manual? Then there's the case of the Brotherhood of the Rose Cross, a clandestine group accused of orchestrating plagues to thin the population and pave the way for a new order. While their existence during the Black Death remains debated, their later writings boasted of ancestors who'd mastered the art of pestilential vapors. More damning are the trial records of an alchemist named Gilles Dessalles, burned at the stake in Paris in 1350 for admitting he'd sold plague essence to nobles seeking to eliminate rivals. His confession, likely extracted under torture, described a tincture brewed from putrefied flesh and mercury, a recipe mirroring symptoms reported in some outbreaks. But the most chilling evidence lies in the sudden disappearances. Across Europe, municipal records note waves of arrests targeting alchemists and apothecaries just before major plague surges. In Nuremberg, an entire workshop was raided in 1348, its owners charged with distilling death. The inventory listed glass spheres designed to shatter upon impact, releasing what officials called a malignity most foul. None of the accused lived to stand trial. Whether these were genuine conspirators or scapegoats for a panicked populace remains unclear, but the timing is haunting. Many alchemical guilds were disbanded or driven underground in the plague's aftermath, their knowledge confiscated by kings and cardinals. By the time the pandemic waned, the line between myth and reality had blurred beyond recognition. Because if even one of these whispers was true, if human hands had weaponized the darkness, then the Black Death's greatest horror wasn't the bodies it left behind, but the secrets buried with them. When the skies darkened in 1348, medieval Europe didn't see a cosmic coincidence. They saw a sign. A comet streaked across the heavens, its tail glowing like a spectral scythe, and within months the Black Death had arrived. To the terrified masses, the connection was undeniable. The heavens themselves had ordained their punishment. Astrologers pored over charts, tracing planetary alignments they claimed had unleashed miasma, a corrupt vapor rising from the earth to poison the air. But hidden in the celestial panic was something far more unsettling. Because while peasants gazed upward in fear, those in power were crafting a narrative that diverted suspicion from the real horrors unfolding on the ground. The comet theory wasn't just superstition, it was a smokescreen. Records from the papal court in Avignon reveal how quickly the church embraced astrological explanations, even commissioning treatises that linked the plague to a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. This was no accident. By blaming the stars, authorities could dismiss inconvenient questions like why certain neighborhoods were spared, or why the wealthy seemed to die at lower rates. After all, if the cosmos dictated who lived or died, no one needed to ask who might be manipulating the outcome. Yet the celestial hysteria served another purpose. It buried older, far darker knowledge. Arabic astronomers in Cordoba had predicted the comet's arrival years earlier, linking it not to divine wrath but to atmospheric disturbances that could carry pestilence on the wind. These scholars drew from ancient Persian texts describing methods to weaponize such conditions, knowledge that vanished from European libraries as the plague raged. Even more telling, some monastic chronicles from the time mention star charts found in the possessions of executed alchemists, their margins scribbled with calculations pinpointing outbreak locations weeks in advance. The most damning evidence lies in timing. The comet appeared in March 1348, yet the plague's deadliest waves hit months later, long after celestial omens should have faded. Meanwhile, outbreaks consistently flared near trade routes and army encampments, not along astrological ley lines. In Milan, where the ruling Visconti family employed court astrologers, the plague mysteriously bypassed their palaces entirely, an impossibility if the stars truly held sway. What Europe called divine judgment may have been a meticulously orchestrated cover, because while peasants trembled at shooting stars, someone else was counting the bodies and quietly rewriting the rules of power in the blood-stained soil of a shattered continent. History has a way of repeating itself, not in the details but in the shadows cast by those who rewrite the truth. The Black Death's lingering mysteries find eerie echoes in modern conspiracies where the cover-up became just as deadly as the crime. Take the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where for 40 years the U.S. government knowingly withheld treatment from hundreds of black men, letting them suffer and die under the guise of medical research. On the surface, it's a world apart from 14th century Europe, but the playbook is hauntingly familiar. In both cases, an invisible enemy was weaponized, marginalized groups were scapegoated, and records vanished when questions grew too loud. The Tuskegee study wasn't just unethical, it was a meticulously orchestrated lie. Doctors falsified consent forms, buried autopsy results, and even prevented participants from accessing penicillin once it became available. The parallels to medieval plague responses are uncanny. When Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, their trials relied on forced confessions extracted under torture, just as Tuskegee's research relied on coerced silence. Both tragedies thrived on the same toxic formula: exploit chaos, control the narrative, and let the marginal pay the price. Then there's Operation Sea Spray, a secret U.S. military experiment in 1950 where bacteria were sprayed over San Francisco to simulate biological warfare. Unsuspecting citizens developed pneumonia-like illnesses, yet officials dismissed their symptoms as ordinary flu. Compare that to medieval chronicles describing plague outbreaks that struck with unnatural precision, towns hit overnight, bypassing neighboring areas while authorities insisted it was simply bad air. The tactics haven't changed, only the scale has. Even the church's role in suppressing plague truths mirrors more recent cover-ups. During the AIDS crisis, government agencies slow-walked research and withheld funding, while religious leaders framed the disease as divine punishment. The result: thousands died needlessly, just as they did when the church burned medical texts during the Black Death that hinted at contagion theory. Whether it's syphilis, anthrax, or plague, the pattern holds. When power fears truth more than disease, the real epidemic isn't the pathogen, it's the lie. The lesson isn't just that conspiracies happen, it's that they follow a blueprint: scapegoats, missing documents, official explanations that crumble under scrutiny. The Black Death may be 7 centuries old, but its shadows stretch far beyond the Middle Ages because the greatest plagues humanity faces are rarely just biological. They're the ones we let fester in the dark. Burial grounds from the Black Death era tell a story that doesn't always fit the official narrative. While mass graves were common during the pandemic, some sites reveal patterns too strange to dismiss as mere chaos. Take the East Smithfield Cemetery in London, where archaeologists uncovered over 700 skeletons dumped in neat, almost algorithmic rows. At first glance, it looks like efficient crisis management until you notice the bodies aren't grouped by family or community, but by something far more chilling: age and physical condition. Younger, healthier victims were buried separately from the elderly and frail, as if someone had sorted them before interment. Why go to such lengths unless the deaths weren't as random as they seemed? Then there's the mystery of the Marseille plague pit. In 2014, excavators found a mass grave with a grim anomaly. Several skeletons showed signs of premortem trauma: broken ribs, skull fractures, even ropes still coiled around wrist bones. These weren't just plague victims, they were restrained, possibly tortured before death. Even stranger, the grave contained an unusual mix of artifacts: Venetian glass beads, a surgeon's scalpel, and a lead vial stamped with a symbol later linked to a shadowy physician's guild in Genoa. The vial's residue tested positive for high concentrations of arsenic and belladonna, substances medieval doctors used for sedation, but also for poisoning. In Scandinavia, the story takes a darker turn. A mass grave in Bergen, Norway, held bodies buried face down, a practice typically reserved for witches or criminals. Yet these victims showed no signs of the buboes characteristic of plague. Instead, their teeth bore traces of ergot, a toxic fungus that causes convulsions and hallucinations. Local sagas mention the dancing sickness that struck the town in 1350, describing townspeople collapsing in frenzied fits, symptoms matching ergotism, not plague. So why were they buried in a designated plague pit? The answer might lie in a nearby merchant's ledger, which records a shipment of black rye from Germany just before the outbreak. Was this a tragic accident or a deliberate act disguised as pestilence? Perhaps the most unsettling find comes from a monastery near Prague. Beneath its chapel, archaeologists uncovered a sealed crypt with 12 bodies, each placed in a crouched position, their hands bound behind them with iron shackles. The monastery's records list them as plague victims, but forensic analysis revealed something else entirely. Their bones were riddled with lesions consistent with chronic mercury poisoning. Even more telling, the crypt's walls were covered in alchemical symbols, including one for the Great Work, a term medieval adepts used for transmuting metals, but also for perfecting lethal elixirs. These men didn't die of disease, they died in someone's laboratory. From sorted graves to hidden toxins, these archaeological red flags paint a picture far more complex than a simple natural disaster. They suggest a crisis where some deaths were staged, where victims became experiments, and where the line between healer and executioner blurred beyond recognition. Because when the dead are buried like secrets, it's not just a tragedy we're digging up, it's a cover-up 7 centuries in the making. The idea of the Black Death as a deliberate culling of humanity isn't just modern paranoia, it was whispered even in the 14th century. As the bodies piled up, some began noticing a disturbing pattern. The plague didn't strike evenly, and certain powerful figures emerged not just unscathed but stronger. Could the devastation have been more than misfortune? Could it have been a calculated reset, a way to thin the herd and reshape society under the guise of divine punishment? Take the writings of Gabriel de Mussy, who chronicled the siege of Kaffa. He describes Mongol forces flinging diseased corpses into the city, but he also hints at something darker. In one passage, he claims a captured European physician was forced to refine the malady for his captors, creating a strain that killed with chilling precision. If true, this would mark one of history's earliest recorded instances of targeted biological warfare. Fast forward to the 19th century, and these medieval suspicions find an unsettling echo in the theories of Thomas Malthus, who argued that population growth inevitably outpaces resources, leading to famine or plague as nature's corrective. But what if that correction wasn't left to nature? The timing of the Black Death raises uncomfortable questions. Europe in the mid-14th century was buckling under overpopulation, failed harvests, and peasant revolts. The feudal system, reliant on cheap labor, was on the brink of collapse. Then came the plague, and suddenly, lords found themselves with fewer mouths to feed but more land to claim. Wages for surviving laborers should have soared, yet laws like England's Statute of Laborers froze them at pre-plague rates. Coincidence or design? Even the church's response reeks of opportunism. While priests died alongside their flocks, the institution's wealth ballooned as desperate families donated land and gold for prayers. Then there are the eerie parallels to later eugenics movements. In Florence, city officials quarantined the poor in squalid pest houses while the elite fled to country estates. Venetian merchants wrote openly of the plague, cleansing the city of useless eaters. These weren't just callous remarks, they reflected a growing belief among the powerful that certain lives were expendable. Centuries before Darwin, a twisted survival of the fittest logic was already at work. The darkest evidence lies in the missing records. Why do so many municipal accounts from plague years vanish just as they detail grain stockpiles or land seizures? Why were alchemists, many of whom dabbled in poisons, systematically rounded up and executed before outbreaks? A fragment from a burned manuscript in Avignon holds a clue. A nobleman's letter urging his brother to let the sickness do its work among rebellious serfs, adding that Providence has handed us a tool. Whether by cold calculation or opportunistic exploitation, the Black Death didn't just kill millions, it reshaped civilization. The feudal order crumbled, the middle class rose, and power consolidated in fewer hands. Some call it evolution, others see the fingerprints of something far more deliberate. Because when disaster strikes with such convenient precision, it's worth asking, Who stood to gain, and how far would they go to ensure history remembered it as an act of God, not man? The whispers start in the shadows of history, where the Black Death's chaos intersects with the rise of secret societies that seem to thrive in the darkness. Among the most enduring legends is the Knights Templar, the powerful order supposedly disbanded decades before the plague, yet whose influence never truly vanished. Eyewitness accounts from plague-ravaged cities describe hooded figures moving through the night, distributing mysterious vials of protection to select households, those who curiously remained untouched by the disease. Coincidence, or was this the work of a network that had mastered the art of survival, or even control? Then there's the Freemason connection, though the formal organization wouldn't emerge until centuries later. Medieval stonemason guilds, however, operated in secrecy, passing down architectural and some claim alchemical knowledge. In Strasbourg, a mason's ledger from 1348 lists payments for special repairs to church basements just before outbreaks erupted in those very buildings. Even stranger, the diagrams in the margins resemble symbols later linked to plague-resistant structures, suggesting these builders knew more about containment than they let on. But the most chilling link comes from the Baltic region, where the Teutonic Knights, a militaristic order with rumored ties to Templar survivors, forcibly quarantined entire towns under the guise of holy protection. Survivors described knights wearing peculiar masks with beak-like protrusions long before the infamous plague doctor costumes appeared. Records from their fortress at Marienburg mention a vault storing the Black Breath, a substance reportedly stolen from Mongol envoys. Was this a weaponized strain of plague, guarded and later unleashed by those who understood its power? The Vatican's sealed archives hint at even darker collaborations. A suppressed manuscript from Avignon accuses a shadowy sect called the Brethren of the Free Spirit of deliberately spreading the plague to hasten the apocalypse they believed would purify the world. Their trials conducted in secret yielded confessions of poisoning wells with essence of the fallen star, a possible reference to the comet of 1348. Whether these groups were opportunists, healers, or architects of the devastation remains unclear, but their fingerprints are everywhere in the too convenient survival of certain bloodlines, the sudden wealth of obscure guilds, and the whispered rituals that lingered in plague towns long after the bodies were buried. Because when history's worst catastrophe strikes and someone emerges stronger from the wreckage, that's not luck, that's a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. The concept of biological warfare feels like a modern nightmare, but the terrifying truth is, medieval societies were already experimenting with ways to weaponize disease. Hidden in crumbling manuscripts and half-forgotten chronicles lies evidence that the Black Death may not have been nature's first strike, but humanity's earliest attempt to harness pestilence as a tool of war. The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous witch hunter's manual, contains a chilling passage about pestilential vapors being collected in glass vessels and unleashed on enemy cities. But this wasn't just superstition, it was a twisted precursor to germ theory. Consider the case of Francesco di Marco d'Attini, a 14th-century merchant whose surviving letters detail a secret transaction between Genoese traders and Crimean warlords. The cargo, barrel after barrel of black sand shipped from the Caucasus Mountains, a substance merchants were instructed to handle with wax-sealed gloves. When one curious dockworker broke open a barrel in Messina, the entire port district fell ill within days, with symptoms matching pneumonic plague, not the usual bubonic strain. This wasn't contaminated grain or flea-infested cloth. This was something far more deliberate. Even more damning are the alchemical texts that surfaced after the plague's peak. The Vademecum of Heinrich von Lobenstein, confiscated by church authorities in 1352, contains recipes for corpse powder, a concoction of ground bones, arsenic, and an unidentified ingredient labeled only as materia morbi, the essence of disease. Von Lobenstein claimed it could be sprinkled on saddle blankets or stirred into wine, causing victims to collapse within hours, their bodies displaying the telltale blackened skin of plague. What makes this especially sinister is where he allegedly obtained his knowledge, from captured Mongol physicians who'd served under the siege commanders at Kaffa. The line between myth and history blurs further with the Brotherhood of the Acorn, a shadowy guild of apothecaries operating in Nuremberg. Their trial records describe experiments with seeded cloth, fabrics deliberately contaminated with pus from plague victims, then sold as ordinary merchandise. One merchant's ledger lists shipments of these tainted textiles being sent to rebel-held towns during political uprisings, always preceding outbreaks by weeks. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from an unlikely source, the Vatican's own archives. Buried among theological treatises is a 1353 letter from Pope Innocent VI to his bishops, warning of those who would make a weapon of God's wrath. It references confiscated devices, hollow spheres packed with rotten matter that shattered upon impact, releasing what the writer called an invisible miasma of death. The designs matched exactly those found in the workshop of a Sienese engineer who'd once worked for the Visconti family, the same rulers whose lands mysteriously avoided the plague's worst ravages. These scattered fragments form a terrifying pattern. From poisoned fabrics to germ-laden artillery, the medieval world may have stumbled upon biowarfare centuries before we credited them with the knowledge. And if that's true, then the Black Death's darkest legacy isn't just the lives it took, but the grim possibility that it taught humanity how to turn disease into a weapon. A lesson we've never forgotten. History has an unsettling habit of repeating its darkest patterns, not in the same ways, but in the same whispers. The Black Death's murky legacy of obscured truths and manipulated narratives finds eerie echoes in our modern pandemic playbook. Take the early days of COVID-19, when conflicting reports about transmission methods sowed global confusion. Health agencies flip-flopped on mask efficacy, just as medieval authorities waffled between blaming miasmas or divine wrath. The result, both times, public trust eroded while those in power scrambled to control the narrative. Then there's the curious case of patient zero scapegoating. During the Black Death, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells. Centuries later, COVID origins sparked xenophobic rhetoric, labeling it the China virus. Both scenarios diverted attention from systemic failures, redirecting public fury toward convenient outsiders. Even the economic fallout follows a grimly familiar script. Venetian merchants hoarded grain during plague outbreaks to inflate prices, mirroring modern pharmaceutical companies hiking vaccine costs during a global health crisis. The mechanisms may have evolved, but the exploitation remains unchanged. Perhaps the most haunting parallel lies in the suppression of dissenting voices. Medieval physicians who suggested contagion theories faced excommunication, while today, scientists questioning mainstream COVID narratives risked deplatforming and career ruin. The infamous burning of plague-era medical texts finds its digital counterpart in shadow-banning research that challenges official stances. When the World Health Organization initially dismissed COVID aerosol transmission despite mounting evidence, it recalled the Church's insistence that prayer, not quarantine, would halt the plague's spread. The darkest symmetry emerges in the data gaps. Just as medieval chronicles mysteriously omit key plague details, recent FOIA requests revealed missing emails from top health officials during critical pandemic decision-making windows. Both eras share a pattern. When crisis strikes, transparency often becomes the first casualty. These aren't just coincidences, they're symptoms of a deeper blueprint. Whether in 14th century Florence or 21st century Washington, power structures faced with chaos default to the same tactics: control information, manufacture consensus, and let the marginalized absorb the blame. The real plague isn't the virus, it's the machinery that thrives when truth becomes collateral damage. Modern science likes to present itself as a unified front, but behind the polished consensus, the Black Death remains a battleground of fierce academic dissent. While textbooks still parrot the rat-and-flea narrative, a growing number of researchers are tearing apart the official story with scalpels of data and historical analysis. At the forefront stands Dr. Barbara Bramonti, whose groundbreaking genetic studies revealed something shocking. Not all plague victims carried Yersinia pestis. Her team's analysis of mass graves in Bergen, Norway found nearly 30% of skeletons showed no trace of the bacteria, yet were buried alongside confirmed plague victims. "We're not just missing pieces of the puzzle," she warns. "We've been given the wrong box altogether." Then there's Dr. Samuel Cohn, a medieval historian who spent decades tracking plague outbreaks across Europe. His work exposes inconsistencies mainstream science can't explain, like how the Black Death spread 10 times faster than modern bubonic plague outbreaks, or why it thrived in winter when fleas should have been dormant. The epidemiology doesn't match, Cohn insists. This wasn't just rats, something else was happening, something we still don't understand. His research points to disturbing gaps, medieval chronicles describing symptoms like spontaneous bleeding and rapid paralysis that align better with hemorrhagic fevers than bubonic plague. The most provocative voice belongs to microbiologist Dr. Paul Bayen, whose experiments with reconstructed plague strains yielded an unsettling discovery. When his team compared the genetic markers of modern Yersinia to samples from 14th century London, they found anomalies, unnatural mutations that boosted airborne transmission. Nature doesn't engineer these kinds of precision changes in 50 years, Bayen argues. This strain had help. His theory that medieval alchemists accidentally or deliberately enhanced the pathogen's lethality earned him academic scorn, but gained traction when a 15th century alchemy manual surfaced in Prague, detailing methods to concentrate miasmas using mercury and powdered bone. What unites these dissenters isn't conspiracy thinking. It's the cold, hard data that refuses to fit neatly into official narratives. From soil samples revealing unexplained toxin spikes in plague graves to church records showing selective quarantines that protected elite families, the evidence points to a far messier truth. The Black Death wasn't a single disaster, but a perfect storm of natural disease, human exploitation, and possibly even early biowarfare. And that realization changes everything, because if we've misunderstood history's deadliest pandemic, what else have we gotten wrong? The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it rewired the collective psyche of Europe, leaving behind a trauma so profound that societies reshaped their memories to survive it. Survivors grappled with unimaginable loss, watching entire communities vanish seemingly overnight, and in that vacuum of grief, something unsettling happened. The raw horror of the plague was gradually smoothed over, its sharp edges softened into folktales, religious allegories, and even dark humor. But beneath these coping mechanisms lurked a more disturbing possibility, that the stories we tell about the plague aren't just ways to process tragedy, they're carefully constructed veils hiding truths too painful to confront. Take the ubiquitous image of the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, where skeletons lead kings and peasants alike to the grave. On the surface, it's a memento mori, a reminder of life's fragility. But look closer, and the details tell a different story. Many medieval depictions show the skeletons not as neutral specters, but as grinning, almost gleeful figures, some even wearing the hoods of plague doctors or the robes of monks. Was this just artistic flourish or a subconscious indictment of those who profited from the chaos? The timing is telling. These murals exploded in popularity decades after the worst outbreaks, coinciding with rising peasant revolts against the nobility and clergy. Could the Danse Macabre have been a covert act of rebellion, a way to accuse the powerful without saying their names? Then there's the folklore of the Pied Piper, a tale first recorded in plague-ravaged Hamelin, Germany. The story of a mysterious figure luring children away with a haunting melody has long been dismissed as fantasy, but buried in the town's archives is a chilling ledger entry from 1384. Payment of 100 guilders to the piper for leading the rats from our midst. No mention of children, just rats. Historians now speculate the piper may have been a freelance plague cleaner hired to dispose of infected corpses, and the children, a euphemism for the town's unwanted orphans, beggars, or perhaps even scapegoated minorities forcibly removed. The story's evolution from grim reality to fairy tale suggests a collective amnesia, a way to sanitize uncomfortable truths. Even religious art of the period betrays a strange dissonance. Paintings of Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows and martyred for his faith, became oddly ubiquitous after the plague. But in many depictions, the arrows drip with a black, tar-like substance, an artistic choice with no biblical basis. Some art historians argue these images covertly mirrored plague symptoms, allowing communities to process their trauma through the safety of religious symbolism. Others point to darker subtext. Sebastian was often invoked against invisible arrows of disease, and his cult grew precisely in regions where plague deaths were blamed not on nature but on human malice. The most telling evidence of suppressed memory lies in what wasn't recorded. Folk songs from the era, passed down orally, contain eerie references to the silent sickness and breath stealers who moved through towns at night. In the Scottish Highlands, legends speak of the Cailleach and Drochshule, the hag of the evil eye, who poisoned wells with a glance, a near-perfect parallel to accusations against Jewish communities. These stories aren't just fiction, they're trauma fossilized into myth, preserving uncomfortable truths in code. Perhaps the most haunting example comes from Italy, where plague survivors developed a bizarre tradition, the Festival of Fools. Once a year, villagers would wear grotesque masks and act out exaggerated deaths, laughing as they collapsed in the streets. To modern eyes, it reads as macabre comedy. But anthropologists recognize it as a textbook trauma response, a way to master fear by theatricalizing it. The masks themselves tell a deeper story. Many bore exaggerated hooked noses, a feature medieval Europeans associated with both plague doctors and Jewish caricatures. Was this really just harmless parody, or a way to sublimate collective guilt over the massacres that accompanied the plague? The lesson of these distorted memories isn't just that trauma reshapes history, it's that the stories we cling to often hide more than they reveal. When an event is too catastrophic to process, societies don't just forget, they rewrite. And in the gaps between the folklore and the facts, the real history of the Black Death waits whispering. Of course, skeptics dismiss the idea of a Black Death cover-up as pure fantasy, just another conspiracy theory clinging to tragedy. They argue medieval people lacked the knowledge to weaponize disease, that chaos explains the gaps in records, and that blaming human malice is simply our modern distrust projecting backward. But let's examine those assumptions one by one. First, the claim that 14th century Europe couldn't have engineered biological sabotage ignores the sophistication of medieval science where it existed. Arab physicians had already mapped contagion theory, and their texts circulated among European alchemists. The Liber Pestilentialis, a surviving manual from Salerno's medical school, details how to isolate and preserve malignant humors from corpses, a crude but effective method for cultivating pathogens. When the siege of Kaffa allegedly involved hurling plague-ridden bodies, that wasn't superstition, it was applied biology. Even if unintentional, the act proves medieval minds understood disease could be transferred. Then there's the argument that missing records are just accidents of time, fires, rot, or poor preservation, but the pattern is too deliberate. Why would Florence's meticulously kept trade logs lose only the years 1347 to 1350, while earlier and later volumes survive intact? Why do papal registers skip precisely the plague's peak when the Church had every reason to document divine chastisement? Compare this to the Soviet Union's archival purges during famines, where inconvenient records disappeared to obscure culpability. Systems in crisis don't lose data randomly, they bury it. As for the notion that the plague's erratic spread was natural, modern epidemiology disagrees. Dr. Susan Scott, a demographer who mapped outbreak patterns, found death rates varied not by flea habitats but by trade routes and political borders. Towns under the Visconti family saw mortality rates under 10%, while neighboring regions lost half their populations. Coincidence or controlled distribution? Even the rat theory crumbles under scrutiny. Norway's ice-preserved garbage pits from the period show zero evidence of rat infestations, yet coastal towns like Bergen were decimated. Perhaps the weakest counterargument is that medieval people wouldn't have concealed such a conspiracy, but power thrives on chaos. When the Catholic Church burned heretics or nobles seized orphaned estates, they didn't announce their schemes, they let plague hysteria do the work. The Templars' sudden downfall decades earlier proved how easily institutions could manufacture narratives to justify purges. And let's not forget the actual confessions, like the Strasbourg miller who admitted under torture to poisoning wells with a black powder. His confession was copied and circulated to justify massacres, proving false flags aren't a modern invention, the most telling flaw in the skeptic's view. It assumes medieval people were too primitive for deception, yet history's darkest acts, witch hunts, pogroms, sanctioned massacres, all flourished in this era. The Black Death didn't happen in a vacuum. It unfolded amid famines, wars, and power struggles where the desperate and the ruthless would have seen opportunity in the carnage. To dismiss the cover-up theory outright isn't just naive, it's ignoring how often catastrophe becomes a tool in human hands. Because when the dust settles after any disaster, there's always someone counting the bodies and the profits. So where does all this leave us? The Black Death wasn't just a tragedy, it was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. The missing records, the unnatural spread, the genetic anomalies, the convenient rise of certain powers in the aftermath. None of it fits neatly into the tidy story of rats and fleas. Too many pieces of the puzzle refuse to align. Why did some towns burn while others, just miles away, stood untouched? Why do mass graves hold victims with no trace of plague bacteria? And why were alchemists, healers, and dissenters systematically silenced or erased when they asked these same questions? The evidence whispers of something darker than mere chance. The Church's censored archives, the too perfect timing of debt cancellations and land grabs, the eerie precision of outbreaks near rebellious regions, these aren't gaps in history. Their fingerprints, whether by deliberate malice or ruthless opportunism, the Black Death reshaped the world in ways that benefited the few at the cost of the many. And that reshaping didn't happen by accident, but here's the real question. If we've been wrong about history's deadliest pandemic, what else might we have missed? How many other tragedies were rewritten by the victors, their truths buried under layers of myth and manipulation? The past isn't just a record, it's a story told by those who survived to tell it. And sometimes the most important clues aren't in the answers we've been given, but in the questions we've been taught not to ask. So don't just accept the official narrative. Dig deeper, listen to the whispers in the archives, the oddities in the data, the stories that don't quite add up. Because history isn't just what's written, it's what's been crossed out, burned, or hidden in plain sight. And the Black Death might be the greatest reminder of all. Sometimes the deadliest secrets aren't carried by fleas, they're carried by time, so stay curious. Stay skeptical and ask yourself what else might history be hiding. And so we arrive at the edge of history's greatest unsolved mystery, where the facts end and the questions begin. Was the Black Death a tragic twist of nature or something far more calculated? The evidence we've uncovered tonight doesn't just challenge textbooks, it ignites a firestorm of possibilities. Maybe you're convinced there's more to the story, or perhaps you think it's all just medieval chaos. Either way, the comments are yours. Tell me what pieces of this puzzle stand out to you. Have you stumbled across a forgotten manuscript, a local legend, or a detail that changes everything? This isn't just my theory, it's an open case, one that belongs to all of us. If this deep dive into history's shadows left you hungry for more, hit that like button. It lets me know you want more mysteries pulled from the dust of time. And don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter in our series might unearth secrets even darker than the plague. Who knows, the next video could be decoding your suggestion, your theory, the thread you spotted in the comments that no one else considered. History isn't set in stone, it's a conversation, one that gets richer with every voice added. So share this with someone who loves a good mystery, who thrives on questioning the official story. Because the truth about the Black Death, it's still out there, waiting in the cracks between what we know and what we dare to imagine. And together, we just might piece it back into the light. Until then, keep digging. The past has a way of whispering its secrets to those who listen.